Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Kelly Writers House. My name is Al Filreis, and I am the faculty director of the Writers House, which has been operating nearly 20 years. And I've been to probably 70% of the events that have happened here in 20 years. And I can't remember an event that I was as excited about as this one for a number of reasons. This is something that we at the Writers House have wanted to do, this kind of collaboration. This is perfect. This intimate place is perfect for this. I think you're about to find out why we're so excited. I just wanted to do a general introduction, and then FIROOZEH will go from there and sort of describe the structure of the next hour. First of all, we're recording this event, both video and audio, and in a few days, if you go to the Writers House web calendar, which is easy to find, you'll see links to both the video and audio. And what we hope you will do is take that link and pass it to your friends around the country and around the world and allow them to watch this. It'll always be there. It's going to be archived. First and foremost, we at the Writers House want to thank our colleagues and friends at the Middle East Center. You're about to hear more from FIROOZEH KASHANI-SABET, who is the director of the Middle East Center. I guess we call you the faculty director. Whatever you like. All right. Well, Mehmet is here. He's got a director title too. So, but anyway, Mehmet, I'm going to Darakçoğlu. I did well, didn't I? These two really make the Middle East Center happen, and we're just grateful to be your colleagues and friends. This program, very unusual program, has been co-sponsored by the Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department. And Neely Gold is one of the representatives who's here tonight, a colleague from that department, the Penn Women's Center, the departments of English and History, the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Penn, the Free Library of Philadelphia is a co-sponsor, and of course, the Kelly Writers House. This program is part of a series at the Writers House called Writers Without Borders, which is a series of programs. You can tell by the title, you know, how important this is to us. We've really tried to get ourselves motivated to do programs like this. It is, as FIROOZEH can tell you more than anybody, it is complicated to organize programs like this, and we like to do it. And Seth Ginns, who's an alumnus of the University of Pennsylvania, who believes in the idea of Writers Without Borders, has funded the entire program, the entire project, the series, and we're really pleased and thank Seth for it. We have books for sale, and I just picked up a random one, my colleague FIROOZEH's book, Martyrdom Street. So we have books. It's the shortest one, and maybe it's the inexpensive one. But anyway, I'm just holding this up as a sample. But the recent books of each of our special guests, our panelists, is available. So afterwards, and Ayla is back there, and she's sitting there waiting to sell them. We sell them at cost. We're not making any money, obviously. And we have spent all afternoon. Where's Allie Katz? Is she around? This is Allie Katz, our program coordinator, and she spent the whole day thinking about this. And she has, you know, we've got Persian bread, we've got dates, we've got just incredible array of Persian food, and we want you to stay and hang out with us and drink and be merry and get a chance to talk to these amazing people. So thank you again for coming, and FIROOZEH, it is all yours. You can explain the structure, and we'll go from there. And if you want to go to Q&A, we have a portable mic. We can get ready.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. Our weather cooperated more than normal this season. At least we don't have snow, rain, you know. First of all, I want to thank all of our colleagues at the Kelly Writers House. This is a wonderful venue, I think, for a reading. It's quaint. It's very anti-Penn in many ways. No Wharton influences here. So we're in a safe community. But it's just been really a privilege to work with Kelly Writers House, and we really are grateful for the support of bringing in what I hope will be more mainstream Iranian-American literature. Just a couple of words about the inspiration for this panel. I've read and admired the works of all the women here for the past decade, and so I had met some of them, and others I had not. And I thought it would really be a wonderful opportunity to convene a panel like this at Penn. We have a strong literature program here, but one that I think still has not embraced Middle Eastern themes and literature in ways that it ought. And I hope that this might be a beginning to sort of an introduction into that. The way the panel is shaped is actually very simple. I've asked my wonderful colleagues here to introduce themselves and to say a few words about the inspiration for their works, why they decided to write, and then to give us a reading from their works. And then we're going to open it up to Q&A. I hope that you'll enjoy it. You'll see a nice range and variety of voices and writings here that I hope will be both complementary, and I hope it'll inspire you to read more Iranian-American fiction and, heck, Persian literature as a whole. So thank you again to everyone. A special thank you to Mehmet as well, and to Jessica, and to Ali, and to Al, and all of our colleagues here. Did I leave anyone out? I hope not. Thank you, and thank you all for coming and making this evening possible.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anita Amirazvani. It's great to see so many of you here tonight on a cold night. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm the author of the novels The Blood of Flowers and Equal of the Sun, which are both set in Iran, and I sometimes laugh because I seem to be stuck in the 16th and 17th centuries. I keep trying to sort of get myself out of that time period, but I haven't been able to yet. Those periods in Iranian history have exerted a lot of fascination for me. Actually, they've really spurred my imagination for the last 10 years, and it feels like it's the place, it's been my mental home, really, for the past 10 years, which is kind of weird, because normally I walk around Berkeley, California, and have cappuccinos and stuff, but in my head, I'm somewhere else, and, you know, I'm wearing this beautiful robe, and it's, you know, it's got paisley patterns on it, and, you know, life is really different. I think some of my inspiration, it certainly comes from the fact that I visited a lot of pre-modern sites in Iran, but it also comes from a feeling that this period of Iranian history hasn't been covered at all, pretty much, or very little, I should say, in fiction in English. And so I felt like it's been really rich territory for me to explore, to think about, and to write about. So today I want to read to you a little bit from my second novel, Equal of the Sun, which is set, it opens in the year 1576. This is the time where Queen Elizabeth ruled England. And of course, everybody knows the story of Queen Elizabeth and King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn and the Tudors and all those people. It's practically ingrained on our foreheads now, given how much it's been covered. And yet, there was also in Iran during this period really fascinating characters, both men and women, historical characters who fought for power in the Iranian court. And so this is the story that I am telling in Equal of the Sun. So I'd like to read to you a section where the main character, whose name is Pari, is lobbying the Shah, who is her brother, for clemency for two people who have been condemned. And I just want to add as a side note that historically it's accurate that women at the Iranian court really fought for power, which I think is a really rather little known fact, because so often this period in Iranian history and Middle Eastern history is stereotyped as a period where women basically had no power. But in fact, at courts, they often had quite a lot of power and fought vigorously and sometimes quite bloodily for the things they believed in. I should just add before I start that Pari's brother's name is Ismail, and his mother was Sultanam. And this is narrated by Pari's main assistant, a eunuch. When we arrived, we were shown into a small guest room with fine carpets. Sultanam and Ismail sat very close to one another, drinking tea spiced with cardamom and eating sugar crystals brightened with saffron. With her broad frame and wedge of curly white hair, Sultanam looked twice as big as Ismail, who was still thin despite the richness of the palace diet. Paris saluted Ismail as the Lord of the universe, thanked him for inviting her into his presence, and inquired after his health. The formalities done, Ismail did not delay. "I know why you're here," he said. "The answer is no, no more meetings." This Shah, I thought, did not understand the first thing about diplomacy. "That's not my purpose," Paris said. "I come to you with great humility to ask a favor." "What is it?" "I've heard of your decision to execute Khulafa Rumlu and Hossein Beg. As your sister and as a member of the royal family, with years of experience at court, I beg you to show them mercy. Hossein is a traitor, and Khulafa is an ungrateful wretch. They don't deserve mercy." "Perhaps not, but the question is how the noblemen will view their executions," Paris said. "If you kill Khulafa, they will wonder why a man of wisdom and high standing, who did everything to bring you to power, has been sacrificed. Being fearful of the same fate will make them dangerous. If you kill Hossein Beg, they'll understand why, but show clemency, and they'll see you as merciful." "Why do you care? What are these men to you?" "They're nothing to me, but it's a matter of justice. Khulafa was your biggest ally. I think we owe him thanks for his support. And Hossein Beg? The loyalty of his tribe is worth a great deal. Even though he was a traitor, he wasn't a traitor. He simply didn't select the winning side." Ismail turned to his mother. "Mother, what do you think?" Paris looked at her expectantly. She had often been successful in begging her father for clemency and had no doubt saved Ismail himself. "I think your sister is right about Khulafa," Sultanam said. "Why destroy a brilliant strategist? To demonstrate that no disobedience will be tolerated is valuable." "But it wasn't disobedience, it was merely disagreement," Paris said. "What's the difference?" Paris looked bewildered. "Surely you'll permit your subjects to disagree at times." "Of course," he said. "I'm listening to you right now, aren't I? But Hossein Beg is a lost cause. By opposing me, he'll always be a rallying point for the dissatisfied. As for Khulafa, his execution sets an important example to the others about the behavior I expect. By dying, he'll serve me better than by living. But I've made my decision. I beg you, reconsider. When our father was alive, his brother rebelled against him several times, but it wasn't until he joined forces with the Ottoman army that he had him captured and executed. Surely your noblemen deserve mercy." "I am not my father," Ismail said, "and I intend to be quite a different Shah than he was." Paris looked exasperated. "But if not for his clemency, you yourself would have been executed." Ismail's face flushed with anger. "I'm alive because it was God's will that I should become Shah." No one could disagree with that. "Khulafa isn't the only person at court who needs to be disciplined," he continued. "Some wish to usurp my power, but they won't succeed." Paris remained calm at the insinuation. "I offer my opinion with the sole goal of strengthening your rule." Ismail snorted. "Next time you should wait to ask if I desire your opinion." Paris drew back, offended, and turned to his mother for reinforcement. "You must heed the words of my son," she said quietly. "But you're depriving a man of his life, the only worthwhile thing he has. Surely you would expect an argument." "On the contrary, I expect to be thanked for listening," he said. Ismail put a roasted pumpkin seed in his mouth and cracked it open. I hoped Paris would say something conciliatory, but she frowned, as if a bad smell had invaded the room. Ismail spat out the shell. "There's nothing left to discuss. You may go." Paris arose stiffly and walked out of the room without thanking him for seeing her. I asked permission to be dismissed and followed behind, cringing at the disrespect she had shown. "I should have fought harder," she said, as we walked through the gardens. The roses looked wilted in the heat. "What good would that do?" "Perhaps none, but I owe it to Khulafa. He deserves to live." "May God have mercy on his soul tomorrow," I replied. "But I think it's most important now to earn back your brother's trust." "He doesn't desire honesty." "Isn't it vital to convince him that you're his ally?" Not if it means compromising what is right. The men would be executed in the morning. I felt sorry for their wives and families, for I knew how their faces would twist with agony when they received the bodies wrapped in bloody white sheets. Their children would suffer too. I remembered my own sister's screams of distress, even though she was too young to understand what had happened. And yet, rather than advance the cause of the condemned, Paris had managed to hurt her own standing with her brother. Paris was watching me closely. What is it? If your brow could make storm clouds, it would be pouring. I took a deep breath. Princess, you know the old saying, the rose is heartless, yet the nightingale sings to it all night long. Why should I sing to a stem of thorns, she scoffed. Because you want to win. Her face darkened. Shit-eater. I was offended and slowed my gait so that she would know it. Paris waited for me to catch up. I know your advice comes from the bottom of your heart, but you cannot understand the fury that seizes me. Princess, don't you fear for your life? Look how casually he's destroying his allies. She threw back her head and laughed. Fear for my life? The blood of the Safavi lions roars in my veins. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marjan Kamali, and I'm thrilled to be here tonight. Kelly Writer's House won my heart because I stepped into the kitchen. So thank you for all the effort you've put into preparing this lovely evening. And it's a special treat to be here because FIROOZEH, or as you know her, Dr. Kashani-SABET, and I, well, we were kids together in New York City back in the 1980s, and it's kind of funny to see how life sort of works out sometimes. So it's a real treat to be here. Thank you for having me. You know, back when I was a kid in New York in the 1980s, as the child of Iranian immigrants, I had a few choices for what I could be when I grew up. I think they're familiar. I could be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or if all else failed, go to business school. So I went to business school. And I remember sitting in Columbia Business School, and right across the walkway was the creative writing building. And I kept wanting to be in that building, but I was in, you know, my building. And those of us who had majored in liberal arts were told to take math camp so that we would learn calculus and come up to speed. And I was sitting one day in math camp, and I was introduced to this thing called Excel. And I'd never seen it before. And I thought, wow, there's so much you can do with this. And of course, I wasn't paying attention to what you were supposed to be doing with it. But I kept thinking, what if an Iranian mother used this to rate men for her daughter? And so I started to write a story right then and there. And it was what I thought was a short story about this kind of obsessed mother, and then later on, it turned into the first chapter of my book, Together Tea. So needless to say, I did finish business school, but I also managed to get a creative writing degree, and it took many years, but I am proud to say I am a writer. I am an Iranian-American writer, and there's many of us. And our voices are growing, and we are now more mainstream. And Together Tea is sort of a mainstream book, which is unusual. It's about war and revolution, and it's a really happy book. So there you have it. It covers the story of the Rezai family. They live in Iran during the 1979 revolution, and they stay after the revolution. It is really the war with Iraq that makes them leave. Quite suddenly. So imagine, you know, your life as it is now with your assignments and appointments and get-togethers, and then you are told that you need to leave the country and you can take a few suitcases with you. Well, the Rezai family arrives in New York City with their suitcases and with a lot of hope. The father, Baba, is excited to be here. He's an optimist. He embraces the U.S., but his wife, Darya, has a very different reaction. She finds it very difficult to adjust, and she longs for Iran. She misses the mother that died in a bomb there and the father that she left behind, but she has to stay here in the U.S. And so a long time ago, she wanted to be a mathematician, and but life happens. That never really panned out for her. So she pours all her desire for structure and sort of formulas and control into the lives of her children. And I'm going to read for you, I will not forgive you. No, I'm kidding. That's okay. That would probably be me. I thought it was my phone. Okay. I'm going to read for you halfway through chapter 1, where Darya, the mother, is talking to her daughter Mina, who is now 25. They're in New York City. And she's showing her the graphs and charts and calculations on available Iranian-American men. In Darya's bedroom office, the sight of her 2-drawer metal filing cabinet drained Mina's energy. She knew what woe those alphabetized folders held inside. Let's see now. Darya sifted through a file drawer. Mr. Jahanfard, Mr. Sami, Mr. Bidar, Mr. Ahmadi. She flipped through folders labeled neatly in Farsi. Ah, here he is. Darya swished out a bright yellow folder. Mr. Dashti. Look, she pulled out a piece of paper from the folder and held it up. It was a neatly typed CV. Your father's aunt's friend in Atlanta faxed me his resume after speaking to Mr. Dashti's uncle's wife. Look at this. He studied chemistry at Yale, got a bachelor's and a PhD. He then received a master's in business administration from Stanford. He likes Persian music and he plays the sitar. He has a very good job with Kodak in Atlanta now, running his own research department. Mr. Dashti decides the balance of the chemicals for each roll of film. Darya folded her arms across her chest, then added quickly, his mother was quite pretty. Mina stared at the wallpaper. She realized she really hated wallpaper. Look at this, Mina. Darya pointed to another sheet of paper titled Family Background and Health Issues. This took me hours to research. No history of disease in his family. Everybody healthy. One sister got divorced a few years ago, but I'm told it was for the best. You have to behave next Sunday at tea, Mina. You must. I talked to your father's aunt and to her friend in Atlanta, and everyone agrees he's the one. Mina plopped onto the bed. Darya loved to calculate the statistics of available Persian bachelors, factoring in their attributes, family histories, education, the probability for divorce. She had her very own system of assigning numbers to certain qualities. 5 for good teeth, -10 for having only a bachelor's and no graduate degree, +20 if it could be proved that they were kind to their mothers, +7 if they didn't hold their forks like shovels. Darya was so proud of her knowledge of Excel, fond of making graphs. Where was the mother Mina used to know in Iran? A magician had made that mother disappear over the years and replaced her with this chubby, red-haired, meddling matchmaker. The mother she knew back then would never have done this. Find someone who knew a well-educated man, do the research, make the calls, send a photograph of Mina if requested, and then, bound by some ridiculous obligation to their own meddling matchmakers, these men would board trains or planes or get in their cars and come to tea. Darya, I don't want to have tea with Mr. Dashti next Sunday. I don't want to meet him. I don't want to get married. You know that. Darya opened her mouth to say something, but her lips froze in the shape of a perfect 0. Then she turned and talked to the bedspread. My daughter says she doesn't want to get married. Interesting, no? What makes her say this? Youth? Youth and complete lack of knowledge? Mina, I want you to meet Mr. Dashti. Do you know the percentage of divorce in this country? The probability of women over 30 getting married? Mr. Dashti's spreadsheet is very hopeful. Forget Jahanfard, forget Bidar, forget all those oafs who came over and made you bored and who you conveniently avoided any eye contact with and spilled tea on. I'm forgiving that, forgetting it, whoosh, gone, who cares? But this time, Mina, this time, I've computed statistics. You don't even know him. I'm your mother, Mina, I know you. Did it ever occur to you that I'm a lesbian? Lesbian, Darya snorted. Don't think I don't know about lesbians. We had lesbians in Iran. You know how we knew they were lesbians? From their lovers. You don't even have a girlfriend, Mina. You're no lesbian. I'm just trying to get through grad school. Why would I even want a husband now? Everybody in this life needs a partner. I don't. You need someone. What's going to happen when I die? Who's going to take care of you? When you're all alone and old? Your brothers? Who'll wipe your nose when you're sick? I'll wipe my own nose. I'll call a friend, hire someone. I'll put signs on tree trunks for a nose wiper. You need someone, Mina. You need to have everything you didn't have. Mina finished the sentence for her. No, Mina, Darya said quietly. Not everything I didn't have. Everything I had. I want you to taste life the way I have, to give you a fraction of what I was given. I want you to have a passion. I want you to fall in love like I fell in love. Your marriage was arranged. It wasn't arranged. It was encouraged. I got to know your father. I took the time. I loved my mother. I knew she wouldn't do me wrong because my mother... Darya broke off and cried silently into her hands. Her mother had been killed by a bomb during the Iran-Iraq War. She had been buying pomegranates at the grocer's downtown when the bomb blew the grocer's stalls into shreds. Darya often cried when she talked of Mamani. Mina's body grew slack as she remembered asking Mamani for those pomegranates years ago. But she forced her body up straight. Darya's tears over Mamani were nothing new. Because, Darya looked up, her face wet but suddenly calm. Because, Mina, my mother gave me a gift when I was 19. Don't you see? She gave me a gift, and at the time I was young too and foolish and couldn't appreciate what she'd found for me. I attended my own wedding only because in those days we didn't refuse our parents' choices. It took years for me to realize what she had done for me, the happiness that she placed into my hands. Mina thought of her father's few wiry hairs, his uneven teeth and self-help tapes, his bulging stomach and the way he listened to American songs on the radio, hearing the lyrics all wrong. That's the gift Mamani gave her? That's the happiness Darya was talking about? It's ridiculous, Mina said. You can't pick a spouse for someone else. How do you know what's right for them? It's been done for centuries. This, the way they do it here, this is ridiculous. You can't pick a spouse for yourself. How does one person, one young person, know what's right for them? When you were 15, did you think the way you do now? Well, when you're 30, you'll look back on today and laugh at your thoughts. It's like anything else when you're young. Vegetables, cod liver oil, a jacket on a seemingly warm day. Your mother says, take it, it's good for you. You refuse, it seems unnecessary. Then you realize she knew you better than you know yourself. That's why she's your mother. Darya's red bound bounced as she talked. Don't you think I know how you feel? I cried like you cry by yourself at nights now. I didn't want to get married, didn't even find Baba attractive. I wanted to get a PhD in mathematics and become a professor. I always thought I would contribute something huge to academia, that I would be remembered for a theorem or proof or something. I couldn't even imagine not being a famous mathematician back then. When my mother introduced your father to me, I hated him. I hated her for pushing him on me. I spent several months, years even, resenting the marriage. So, what happened? What happened is I grew up. What happened is your father. He gave to me, consistently and unselfishly worked to make me happy. One day I woke up and looked at him and my house and my swollen stomach and realized I was happy and didn't even know it. I heard about a woman receiving a prize in mathematics and I left. I didn't care. When my mother died, I couldn't have survived it without your father. No professorship in math would have saved me then. Darya absently picked up her hairbrush and twirled it in her hand. Besides, she continued, remember when you were 18 and we went to the mall and I bought you that denim shirt? Remember how you didn't want to get it? How you hated it then? Now you wear it almost every day. Mr. Dashti is not a shirt. He wears nice shirts. Darya. Mina felt a tiny tickle in her stomach. A quiver worked its way down to her toenails and her mouth burst open. She couldn't stop laughing. The insanity of their conversation. Mr. Dashti wears nice shirts. Her father, as a gift, Mina imagined a huge red bow tied around Baba's bald head. She snorted like a pig as tears soaked her cheeks. She thought of the graphs. Mr. Jahanfard, Mr. Bidar, Mr. Dashti, the slopes of the lines Darya calculated. She thought of the gift, her poor, dead grandmother's gift. Through her tears, she caught sight of her mother. Darya stood in her pink and white house dress, her pudgy feet pointing out, the Dashti folder in one hand, her hairbrush in another. Her roots showed. The fiery red dye was in need of a touch-up. When they left Iran, Darya had vowed to dye her hair red if she could ever reach a country where she didn't have to wear a headscarf. On one of those first mornings in New York, Darya had disappeared into the hotel bathroom for 30 minutes. When she emerged from the bathroom with her hair in a towel, Baba had clapped loudly for her, whistling and cheering, urging Mina and her brothers to join in. Mina could see Baba now, the pride on his face as Darya shyly removed the towel from her wet hair, how he went to the bathroom and cleaned the walls that had been stained crimson, just as he had cleaned her grandmother's body after it had been stained crimson from the bomb at the grocer's those years ago. Silence replaced Mina's laughter. Her body hiccuped slowly a few times as she got up. Darya was quiet, her eyes confused. Oh, Maman, Mina said as she took the hairbrush from Darya's hand and sat her down on the bed. Do you think I should wear the lavender dress with a cardigan or just by itself when I meet Mr. Dashti? She placed the hairbrush at the gray roots on her mother's head and slowly brushed her hair. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Persis Karim, and it's a great pleasure to be at Kelly Writer's House. I came here, I think, 5 years ago, also at the invitation of FIROOZEH, and it's really lovely to be here. Thanks for having all of us. And it's also really great to be with such a fine group of talented women. I guess I have the dubious honor of being the only non-novelist on this panel. So if you expected me to be a novelist, I'm not. I wish I could say I am, but my claim to fame probably is much more linked to the fact that I've been involved with some anthologies, three, and the most recent of which is the Tremors book that's out there, which Anita and I co-edited. And I'll just say a little bit about the anthology because I think it's a wonderful collection, and I think in some ways it's doing some of the work that we are doing as writers, which is to really identify a shift among Iranian-American writers from poetry and memoir into more comfortably writing fiction. And Anita and PAROCHISTA have been involved with fiction writing for a lot longer than some people. The collection is really wonderful because I think, represents a diverse set of writers with diverse perspectives, some of whom are born in Iran and lived a long time there, and some people who are like me, born in the US, and whose connection to Iran is much more tenuous. So the first section is called American Homeland, and they're stories that really focus on Iranians in the US. The second section is Iran, Land of Resilience, and focuses on stories that take place in Iran. And then the third section is called Other Land. And those are stories by Iranian-American writers that don't necessarily have Iran or Iranian-Americans as a focus, but in some ways really identify the way that being Iranian-American has given this perspective on looking at and having compassion for the idea of the other. So I'm going to read a little section of the story I have in here called Something to Pray For. And it's based on a true event. Some of you remember that guy George Bush, and some of you remember John Ashcroft. After 9/11, of course, many of us felt like we had fallen under the suspicion of the United States yet again. We had just recovered from the dark cloud of the hostage crisis, and 9/11 happened, and Iranians felt in many ways that they were implicated, either indirectly or directly. And of course, after George Bush gave his Axis of Evil speech in January 2002, that link became even more forged in the minds of policymakers. But John Ashcroft issued a special registration for people who were living in the United States that were of origins of countries that had fallen under suspicion after 9/11. So Somalis, Kuwaitis, Saudis, Iranians. And the incident occurred in Los Angeles County. This special registration announced on the radio, asked people of these various countries to come in and show their papers to make sure that they were legally there. And instead, they were held in the county jails for several days without any access to their families, and essentially had their civil rights violated, which was one of the sad outcomes, of course, of the post-9/11 climate. So this is from the point of view of an older Iranian gentleman named Mohsen, who's part of this special registration and is in jail. Mohsen hadn't remembered to put his cell phone in his pocket that day. His wife usually insisted that he carry it with him at all times, even though he rarely turned the ringer on. He was a product of another time. Letters and personal visits over tea were still part of his life, even in his adopted country. But now, sitting on the cold concrete floor in a jail cell, crowded with what seemed like hundreds of men, he imagined how comforting it would be to speak with his wife or his son, Ehsan, who'd only recently finished law school. Sir, a tall, thin man with a boyish face and a hint of red in his hair said to him, nudging his shoulder, "Are you okay, sir?" Mohsen must have looked sick and pale, and the faraway look in his eyes must have indicated some need that distinguished him from the crowd of dark-haired, unshaven men, Arabs and Iranians like himself. Mohsen looked up at the man and nodded. "I'm all right, but it's hot in here. I need to call my wife. Is there any water, please?" "You want water, sir?" The tall man yelled above the din of male voices in the cell. "Come on, I'll show you the bathroom and the drinking fountain." Mohsen rose to his feet and looked at the shiny name tag pinned to the officer's shirt just above the chest pocket. Kinder. He pondered the name and the predicament it raised. He knew how pronunciation had a way of bringing out the worst in people. He said it aloud to himself in English. Was this a nice Englishman or a childlike German? He did this often with names, played with them in his head to make meaning and connect with a person. Whenever he saw a name like Rush or Black or Harder, he'd put it in a sentence, imagining how the person would introduce themselves in Persian. Several days before, he had met an old Dutchman at the community center called Kier. Mohsen smiled and asked him to repeat it because he thought he misheard. I am Kier, the man said. I am penis. This was how Mohsen learned English and learned to laugh in another culture. He was not in the mood to laugh now, though. He nodded to the officer as he moved past several older men sitting next to him whose knees and legs were close enough to touch. He brushed them, mumbling in Persian, "Bebakhshid, excuse me." During the last 24 hours, he'd barely said anything to anyone, even though he heard enough Persian around him to let loose a tirade of frustration and join the mood of the other men, feeling trapped and persecuted. But Mohsen also knew how useless it was to complain. He'd been to the INS offices before. It was an all-day affair, sitting in lines, waiting, filling out forms, and then waiting some more. But this was different. He was sitting in a holding cell, a jail. He felt dirty and criminal. Then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. You Mohsen Amami? A man said to him, looking down as Mohsen sat with holding his, You Mohsen Amami, he said, looking right at Mohsen through his tinted glasses. Mohsen imagined his cold blue eyes sizing him up. He studied the other man's name for a moment. Sher, in Persian, meant poem. The man's name was Sherman. Mohsen suppressed a grin. The fellow hardly resembled a poem or a poet. His body was hunched and his belly hung like a watermelon over his belt. Mohsen thought of a Persian word that more closely resembled the officer, sharm, shame, sharman, I am shame. Yes, I am, Mohsen finally replied. Come this way, the officer gestured with his hand. Mohsen followed the officer down a different hallway, in the opposite direction from the one he'd taken to the bathroom. There were no Christmas decorations, and the hallway was dimly lit. He moved slowly as he passed 3 large posters with many small pictures of America's most wanted terrorist emblazoned across the top. The pictures were poor quality. Some were blurry, as if they'd been enlarged so many times that the original image was no longer relevant. There were hundreds of photos, bearded young men and a few women whose faces peered out from their black hijabs. They were matted inside a large black frame under glass. The names were printed in dark, bold letters below the photos. He caught only a few of them. Mohammed, Ali, Maryam, Hussein, Hassan, common names, names he spoke aloud when he read his Quran, names of friends and their children. His eyes moved across the poster as if searching for someone he knew. Each image of a bearded man bled into the next, and for a second he thought he might see his son's face. His head began to perspire again when he caught a glimpse of his own reflection, reflecting the hallway's light. He was unshaven, old, and against the images of the young people, he saw his face blur into theirs. Sir, let's keep moving, the officer said when Mohsen stopped and continued to stare at the poster. He shuffled along the hallway until they reached the double glass doors. The officer opened it and gestured to a chair beside a steel desk. A man looked up from behind the desk. Have a seat, Mr. Amami. I'm Officer Smith, FBI. The man was well-dressed and had no badges or name tags. He wore a dark blue suit with a plain gray shirt, and he had small rectangular glasses. Mohsen sat down in the chair and quietly asked, How much longer will you keep me here? Not too much longer, Mr. Amami. The FBI, the INS, and local authorities, they're just trying to keep us all safe. He paused and looked at Mohsen, who was distracted in thought. So, what do you do here, Mr. Amami? The man looked down at the papers in front of him and pushed his glasses up his nose. He held a pen in his left hand. You mean my job? I'm retired. I was a doctor in Iran. I came here after the Iran-Iraq War, and the politics and economics in my country made it impossible for me to live there. Sir, you know why you're here. We've had a terrible attack on our country, and we need good people like yourself to help us uncover any threats. Can you help? Help? With what? I am a good Muslim. I pray, pay my taxes. I came to this country 20 years ago, and I don't see why you're holding me. I haven't been able to speak to my wife since yesterday. Mr. Mami, as you well know, the United States was attacked. We're at war. We just want to make sure that everyone who's here is legal, and that if you know anything, you'll tell us. Tell you what, sir? Names, organizations, people you think we should keep an eye on? Mohsen took a deep breath and swallowed. For a moment, he thought of his son again. Eskandar had written from Evin prison about the ways they had tortured him in code. And they had asked him for names of people too, other activists, students, the names of neighbors who demonstrated against the regime in that period just after the revolution. I want to know what my rights are, please, Mohsen said. I think I should have a lawyer and be allowed to speak to my family. Mr. Amami, you're not under arrest or being charged with anything. No need for lawyers. We just want to know if you know anything that can be helpful, people or other Iranians who might be involved with things that we should be concerned about. In all the years that Mohsen had lived in Los Angeles, he'd never once corrected the repeated mispronunciation of his country's name. This time, he could not resist. I am from Iran. We say Iranian, not Iranian. Can't you say it correctly? Mr. Amami, the point is we need your cooperation. I understand your family came as refugees and that your son was involved in a political activity in your country. We know that he was in prison and was charged with terrorism there. Mohsen's temples turned blood red. Curse them, curse that country, curse this one. That was my son. He was murdered. He was just a kid, an idealistic kid who believed in democracy and wanted change in our country. He joined a group that believed they could make a revolution, and they did. They got rid of the Shah, but then he felt betrayed by the new regime because they'd forsaken the revolution. Do you realize how many people like him ended up in prison? Do you know how many of them were murdered in the name of fighting for freedom? Do you know how many of those men out there in that cold room had sons killed in Iran? If they weren't killed in jail, they were killed in the war with Iraq. They were against this regime and the one before it. Mohsen tried to control his anger and quieted suddenly. His head was hot again. He didn't like to use the word freedom because it felt it lacked any serious meaning in America. He hated the way it was used in commercials for cars, sodas, credit cards, and drugs for men wanting to get an erection. He couldn't get used to the way people invoked it and couldn't help remembering Eskendar's words when he was first arrested. Baba Jun, I'm not just fighting for my generation, but for yours too, for people like Uncle Siamak, who died to make Iran free. I'll stop there.
I was telling ParochisTA, the font is so small in this book. It's like 9 points. I'm hoping I'll be able to see it with the glasses even. So I wanted to say a few things about why I wrote the novel and why I decided to write fiction as well as nonfiction. When Marjan was talking about that building in Columbia University where she did her MBA, before I applied to get a PhD, I actually applied for the MFA program at Columbia, and I got in. And, you know, luckily I got into the PhD program a couple months later, and it was a toss-up, you know, this, that, which is it going to be? And I decided that, and I had done a course at Columbia, you know, in the creative writing program. I really enjoyed it, but I also was kind of turned off by it. I felt there were a lot of posers, and, you know, it was just too much. And I also felt that I didn't know enough about Middle Eastern history and Iranian history, and so I appreciate, Anita, your embrace and your love affair, I guess, with Iranian history in that respect. My work is not a historical novel at all, although my next project, I wouldn't call it a historical novel, but it's more informed by history. But the reason why I wanted to write fiction was because all the work that I'd done as an academic, and I continue to do as an academic here and elsewhere, it didn't speak to the emotions of the experiences that many of us have as Iranian-Americans, as Iranians. And let's face it, we're a traumatized generation. I mean, you know. And so the novel and the structure of the novel very much, I hope, reflects that. I was telling PAROCHISTA, I almost wish I'd written it in French. I'm very much influenced by French writers, by explorations of form and style in writing. And so I chose an intertwined narrative structure. So there are three narrators who speak to one another. And I always imagined it as a kind of an onion, because Iranian women, I've learned, are very secretive. You know, they reveal one layer to one person and then another layer to another person. So there are all these, like, you know, little in the interstices here. There are things going on that one person might know about, but not necessarily the other. And so the story is kind of set up, the structure of the novel is very much like that. So there are three narrators, and they have separate tales, but also intertwining tales. So I'm going to read short excerpts from each one. One is from the beginning of the book. I regret to say that I did write a poem, and I will read that. And it starts with that poem, and then it goes into the reflection of the first character. Her name is Nasrin. The second one is another young woman. Her name is Yaseman. And then the last one is an older woman who lives in Iran. Her name is Fatemeh. And it unfolds both in New York City in America and also in Iran, different parts of Iran, but mostly north, the province of Gilan, where my family's from, of course, and, of course, Tehran. So this is the poem. From the shrines of Parsa rise the dust of ages and the murmurs of hidden faces. In this hall of wanderers where winds swallow their whispers, Parsa's prophets, martyrs and prophets, scorn the long shadows cast upon the royal gateway, fearing the day when the earth shall tremble and the hidden shall unveil their faces, rising against tyranny. It happened by chance. I was in the basement, away from all the mayhem on the street. My eyes followed a cockroach scurrying into an empty classroom, where a book lay on some dusty boxes. As the roach crawled onto its frayed pages, he touched my hand bearing down on his antennae, and an instinct directed him to a corner between the boxes and the wall. At last, the collection of poetry was in my hands. At first glance, the poetry book, like the classroom I'd stepped into, seemed of little interest, except maybe to a cockroach. The leather binding, once fastened to the sheets with gold thread, was falling apart. The brown watermarks bordering the margins washed away dark secrets scripted in fine calligraphy. At the slightest human hand, morsels of yellowed paper chipped off the edges of the title page, where someone had inscribed a verse in poor Persian. What was it that attracted me to the book? Was it the seduction of filth, the scent of decadence, or the security of immortality? I found a seat on the floor and began to read. Alongside miniature portraits of naked women, I found stories of Parsa's prophets, recited in the mystical language of a medieval prayer book. I didn't hear anyone calling my name, although later others would claim that they tried to find me. I didn't make much of the light tremors beneath my feet or the vapor that had infiltrated the building. In the poet's mysterious landscape, I saw stone columns sway unsteadily in the wind. I heard the cries of female warriors, the laments of weary mystics, and I saw myself among them. As high flames swallowed the hall of wanderers, I read out loud the way an old dervish had once taught me to recite sacred verses. That must have been why the soldiers found me in the room. Even then, I didn't stop reading. "Who are you?" they asked. I didn't answer. They pointed a gun to my face and grabbed the poetry book out of my hand. "It's mine," I yelled. "You shouldn't be reading this," they said. A soldier started to tear up its pages. I don't know what came over me then. The men meant no physical harm, but I felt the urge to run. Maybe it was the sight of strangers in a place so familiar. Maybe it was the movement of their guns. I grabbed the remainder of the poetry collection from the soldiers' hands and hurried outside the building. When I approached the school gate, I sped into the crowd, my head down and the book still under my arm. I ran fast, behind antique shops and busy side streets, past gas stations and baqalis with no volition of my own, just following the veiled faces around me. A young boy about my age offered me a handgun while another waved a white banner with Quranic adages. "Neither east nor west," they yelled, running faster toward Martyrdom Street. I started yelling too, not revolutionary slogans, but dissonant verses. As my voice melted into theirs, a woman grabbed the poetry collection out of my hands, and we fell to the ground listening. So that was the first character. Her name is Nasrin. The second one is a short excerpt from the other younger woman in the book. Her name is Yaseman, and the excerpt is called The Bloom of Jasmine. The bloom of jasmine, the luster of pearl, the jingle of ivory, the flow of coconut milk, the fall of snowflakes, the innocence of clouds. What is white? Does white feel cooler in the summer or more serene? Do whites prefer white sports like skiing or tell their children white stories on white winter evenings? On the street, white mingles with brown, yellow, and red, but this brand of human paint doesn't mix well. I never grasped the true meaning of white. Feridun entered my life and promised that white did not matter, but he left me for a white. I don't see him in the airport. This is where he met his white. My hairdresser, Maurice, calls me olive, Middle Eastern olive as opposed to Mediterranean olive, which is not so thick and shimmers less in the light. But Maurice is wrong. He's afraid of offending me, and olive sounds so chic. I'm too dark for olive, especially on my face and arms from tanning in the sun. I am brown. Maurice pampers my damaged black hair with hot oil treatments and deep scalp massages, chiding me for having dyed my hair blonde so many times. Why, he asks, refusing to dye my hair light when I requested. Only charcoal black. Maurice prefers dark hues. He is white. Imagine white granulated sugar melting in a pot. That's me, a deep caramel brown. My grandmother told me that when I was born, my mother was convinced I didn't belong to her. I couldn't. I was too dark. When the hospital refused to take me back, my father came after me. He knew I came from him. He was not white. And then the last excerpt is from the older character in the book, and her name is Fatime. And this was actually first published in as an excerpt in Persisa's first collection. Buildings. Everywhere you look, there are buildings. On Inqilab Avenue, 2 solitary walls stand on the left side of the road. It's anybody's guess what this pile of rubble will turn out to be. Maybe a mosque, a business center, or a mall. Or better yet, a monument honoring the dead. The drilling sounds fade as I move beyond the construction zone. Ali Agha, the baker, spits out orange seeds on the cracked cement as he counts some change in his hand. Come to think of it, even his store is a new addition to the street. What time is it? Ali Agha asks as he watches the pedestrians on the opposite corner of the sidewalk. A worker tells him the time from inside the bread shop. It's slow again today, he says, mostly to himself. When he recognizes the customer, Ali Agha motions to his cronies to bring out his sheets of warm lavash. Hurry up, he yells, now sitting erect on the edge of his chair. As the man approaches, Ali Agha holds the bread and says, fresh out of the oven, don't you want to take some to your wife? The pedestrian lowers his head, quickly walking away, and Ali Agha curses at the young employee before eating the bread himself. How am I supposed to run a business, he complains. What's their excuse now? The war is finally over. As I walk past the bread shop, Ali Agha notices me and the scene repeats itself. I was waiting for you, he says, rising from his chair. Some bread, Haji Khanum? I don't fault Ali Agha for his sycophantic ways. He smiles, he calls me Haji Khanum. He politely holds out the bread. The economy is hard on everybody these days. 6 sheets, I say. When I dispense the change, Ali Agha takes my good hand and kisses it. God bless you, he exclaims, following up the blessing with a token prayer. But I quickly pull my hand away. Ali Agha apologizes and I walk away fast. So fast that I don't realize I've walked past the post office. I wipe my good hand against my Islamic robe, rubbing it hard into the cloth until I see a spot of blood. I pass Ali Agha's bread shop every Tuesday on the way to the downtown post office. Today, I take the long route there, through the bazaar and past Mohsen's engineering building. I haven't been to this part of town since the last explosion. Has it already been a year? That day, I stopped by the bazaar. I wanted an appraiser to price her family antiques. They were for my daughter, Nasrin, and I thought she might someday want them for her home. I asked the merchant if he'd be willing to smuggle them out for a modest bribe, but he just rolled his eyes and sighed. I don't know what I was thinking, since back then leaving Iran wasn't an imminent possibility with the war dragging on with no end in sight. But in a state of war, denying reality comes more easily than embracing the truth. Disappointed, I left the bazaar for the post office. A long line curved outside of the building, but compared to the gasoline queues, this one moved swiftly. As I walked in, the mosque projected the noontime prayer call, the azan, which echoed in the neighborhood, and a young woman behind me silently mouthed their prayers. Outside, military planes flew low, circling the neighborhood, and only the azan intruded upon their distant drone. When the prayer call finally ended, the young woman spoke softly to me. They recruited my youngest son for the war, she said. He's 12. Do you have a son?
I shook my head, and then she whispered, "I don't believe in martyrdom." Before I could answer, an altercation broke out between two customers standing ahead of us in line. "It's my turn," a bearded middle-aged man yelled as he elbowed a veiled woman half his size to claim a spot in front of the post office clerk. "What do you mean?" the Chaudhuri woman challenged. "I've been waiting for 20 minutes. As she was speaking, the woman adjusted her veil to hide loose strands of hair. Then she turned to the person behind her to say, "Didn't you just see him walk in the door?" But no one rushed to support her cause. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice, the hypocrisy of her chador, or the weakness of her gender that made her appear guilty. Even though the woman was telling the truth, she sounded less sincere than the man. Finally, the post office clerk intervened to resolve the issue. "Khanum," he said to the Chaudhuri woman, "please cooperate. Let this man finish his business. You'll be next." Before the woman could voice another complaint, there was a loud thump. It was a noise I'd never heard before, as if 20 trucks had crashed into one another. From a distance, the red alert signals, which sounded like truncated ambulance sirens, began to toll. The Iraqis had struck something, but no one seemed to know what. Helicopters had joined the military planes to survey the street. Inside, no one hazarded talking except for the post office clerks, who shouted orders to file people out of the building. "Over here," a young man yelled, and we formed a line behind him. Another loud crash shook the main lobby, and the concrete beneath our feet began to tremble. The young woman standing behind me again prayed silently as she watched a rat scuttle across the floor. Before the rat reached the western end of the lobby, the tiles trembled and we flew out of the building. That's all I remember about that Tuesday afternoon. I'm not even sure if the ground was really shaking after the third blast or whether my knees were betraying me. I'm not sure. Everything happened quickly, maybe within 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much to my fellow readers and to Mehmet and FIROOZEH. This is such a love, and Kelly Writers House, which I've always heard about and kind of always was very excited to read at. I have to just, my name is PAROCHISTA KHAKPOUR, and I just have to give you a slight apology. I'm fairly out of sorts. I'm dealing with a pretty intense bout of late-stage Lyme disease that I've dealt with on and off for the last several years, but I, rather than to cancel this, I thought this is a nice thing and to rise to the, I'm mentally together still, but if anyone knows what Lyme disease is like, you're full of all sorts of bizarre pains and sensations almost all the time. So anyways, just a disclaimer, I hate giving a shoddy reading. So if I'm in poor form, that's the main reason. I generally enjoy these very much. So, okay. So having said that, I am the author of 2 novels now. My second novel's coming out this May. This is just an advanced review copy of The Last Illusion, and but it'll look like this. And my publishers have given me sort of an embarrassing stack of postcards, like a giant white elephant. They've just sent me boxes of postcards, yes, like that. And they're over there, and you can look at them if you'd like, and I don't know, find some use for them. But they have some blurbs and such, and that's in May. But I'm going to read, I might read a tad bit from that. We'll just see how it goes time-wise. I will read from my first novel that came out in 2007, Sons and Other Flammable Objects, and I think this is the last time I'm going to read from this. I've been reading it pretty much nonstop for 7 years, and I'm very lucky it's had such a long life, and I've been able to read from it so much. I thought this is a nice event for me to just end it on among Iranian-American writers. I don't know, it feels like a book from another life, though I've come to like it more as time has gone by, strangely. I'll just tell you, I guess I should tell you a bit about myself. Well, I'm a journalist, essayist, and novelist. And I have wanted to be a writer since I was 4 years old, specifically a novelist since I was 4. I've never been on any other track in my life, and that is tied to leaving Iran at the age of 3.5, 4. We left when the Iran-Iraq war began, and then we journeyed through Europe and then came to the States. And my parents are essentially of a different economic class than I am. They were very upper class, and my brother and I grew up very lower middle class. We shared a room in the bad part of Pasadena, California, in a small apartment. And the sort of culture clash between us and my parents became a source of fascination to me. You know, my dad making us like Wonder Bread sandwiches, but with like caviar in it, you know? And we're like, what is this? We just want peanut butter and jelly or something, you know? So it's a very bizarre childhood. And we were also quite isolated from the Iranian-American community in the west side of LA. It was very affluent and just different than us. We were sort of mostly a very nerdy academic family, aside from my mother a little bit. But my brother and my dad and I, we would just, all we did was just talk about books and reading and writing. And he was also a nuclear physicist, and that was our world. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. That's kind of how I came to things. Let me just give you a little short setup here without being long-winded. Basically, this is a story of an Iranian-American father and son, and of course there's a mother, and then there's a girlfriend as well. Some good women in here, but mainly it's the story of an Iranian-American father at midlife, Darius Adam, and his son Xerxes Adam, and they've been at odds for quite a long time, and this is kind of the story of their ultimate clash and where it kind of came from, and I drag in a lot of things, including 9/11 and Persian history and all that. And so the book becomes an investigation of all that. This in some ways it is quite, I don't know, I guess I am the boy child in many ways. So I'm gonna read you a section that is actually one of the more autobiographical sections that I actually have really no practice reading ever. Nothing like being sick to just give yourself insane challenges. So I'm just going to read this, and then we'll see. Okay. But basically, what you need to know is this is Xerxes at childhood with his mother, Lale, and she Americanizes her name to Lala. And she's taking him from the bad parts of, you know, in my book, essentially Pasadena, and this kind of crummy, whatever, generic, nice suburb, to go to see like the fancy parts of LA, which my mother would always do for us too. And so they go to Rodeo Drive. And this is a celebrity, there's some celebrity cameos in here, and this is a celebrity that we did see when I was a child there, and it was strangely formative, but also very disturbing for me because of the same reasons, I guess. Once when he was young, late single digits he'd guessed, on one of those weekends where Darius chose not to participate, his out for the day meaning an exhaustion and antisocial feeling that demanded he lie sleepless under the covers with the curtains drawn until the day was over, or rather meaning he was feeling restless and therefore all the more antisocial, so he'd silently slip away and seek refuge in the bookstores and research libraries of the local college. On such a mother and son day, Lala took him on a drive through the nice parts of Los Angeles. That was how she phrased it, nice parts, which ended up being a tour of wealthy Beverly Hills and eventually just Rodeo Drive, just a long afternoon drive back and forth, up and down its pathetic, glittering length. 30 miles or so, but worlds away from their hometown, this Rodeo Drive was supposed to embody what his mother thought of as niceness. She told him it was a street for, quote, the best people, which he translated to rich and famous. And so like a dream come true after she finally parked, deciding that they too deserved a walk down the strip of gilded, if not golden, Los Angeles perfection, they encountered their first celebrity. Out of a slick black limousine stepped a black-suited, burly, silver bear of a gentleman, Ed McMahon. Since this television personality was one of the few celebrities Lala Adam would even recognize, after years of savoring McMahon's "Here's Johnny" roar as the Tonight Show announcer in the 60s and 70s, not to mention her deep admiration for his stint in the 1980s as the presenter of American Family Publishing Sweepstakes, who arrived unannounced at the homes of winners, she began waving and panting like teenagers in old concert clips. She urged Xerxes to go ask for his autograph, and when her son refused, she realized she had to do something, so she loudly uttered a joke about whether or not she had won $1 million that either he didn't hear or ignored, and before they knew it, he had disappeared through a dark door on the strip. They just stood there meditating on his appearance. It was anything nice for Xerxes. Ed McMahon, for some strange reason, giving him chills, horrible, very real shudders creeping up and down his spine. Ed McMahon making him feel tense and afraid, downright sick. He didn't figure it out until many years later when reruns of the 1980s talent competition he hosted, Star Search, did the same thing, making him aggressively thumb the remote. At some point, he realized that it was just that Ed McMahon for him reeked of apocalypses. It had to be because the first time he ever saw Ed McMahon in his dark suit and heard his booming tenor was on a night when he was very young, when he used the vision of the man on the screen to block out the sounds of his parents behind their shut door, arguing more loudly than they could imagine about unsolvable big things like wars and dictators and regimes and military and mass deaths, one of their many but first witnessed homeland fights. Ed McMahon had clapped and chuckled and introduced over and onward over their cries and snaps and screams and bangs, but he could not outdo them. Not only was the man useless, trapped in that blaring box, belonging to the applause and confetti realm, his world existing just side by side next to theirs somehow had the effect of making Xerxes feel less safe than ever. He was alone. The voices behind the bedroom door, the voices behind the tube, they were all voices far removed from his own small, high, cracked one. How could he ever explain a phobia of a man, a thing, an institution like Ed McMahonness? The older Xerxes adopted the logic without a fight. Window equated cotton candy. Ed McMahon equated the stench of a simultaneously foreign and native burning his parents and taking his parents and threatening himself. He imagined drilling a hole under the glossy platform of Star Search where Ed McMahon, for thousands of hours of his life, judged painted neon baby entertainers, drilling a hole so deep it would go through the smoldering center of the earth and come out the other end. On the opposite end of McMahon's shiny designer shoes, through the wailing volcanic fodder of the planet's core, would certainly be other feet, and maybe knees, and maybe hands, and hell, torsos of the perpetually aching, ailing, hurting people of the other world, most of the world, that somehow looked more like Xerxes Adam, looked at least as he was supposed to look, that shared with him something he could never quite get in touch with, but clearly had to have. So that's a section from that. It's actually also a funny book. Hard to imagine, but it's always awkward to talk about 9/11 and to say you've written a funny 9/11 book. But I won't read really much. I won't read it from this really, but I will say I'll read just the preface to just give you a bit of an introduction, maybe just a tiny paragraph. But this is now. You know, I guess, is it Toni Morrison? Everyone misattributes this quote. I think it's Toni Morrison who says, write the book you've always wanted to read. And this, it is, right? Thank you. I say it all the time, and I'm just not sure. Because I think it gets attributed to the wrong people sometimes, but Toni, it's good. Write the book you wanted to read. So this was for me this. I was always influenced a lot by Latin-American magical realist writers and surrealists, and I decided to write a sort of semi-fabulous adventure novel of sorts that also uses 9/11 prominently in it, but also most prominently uses a Persian myth that spoke to me deeply. As a child, I had very severe insomnia and anxiety issues, surprise, but and I, you know, like learning English, I very much remember how difficult that was, and I was very tormented by that. I very purposely picked up a Valley Girl accent and would go through it at night to make sure I was saying it right, and so it was very difficult for me. And my father would read me stories from the Persian Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, which is the medieval national epic of Iran. The only way to really explain it is it's like a cross between, say, like the Old Testament and Chaucer. Every Iranian knows it, knows stories from it, and it's thicker than a phone book. Everybody has it in their family, and it's obvious to Iranians why that would ever be an influence. And for me, it was very personal. My dad would tell me stories from that every night, and it was so soothing, and it brought me back to something that was part of my culture that I didn't really even fully understand. But there was one story in there that especially spoke to me, and that was the story of Zal. And Zal, I can read this preface, as I tried to write it so people could understand that link, but I basically do a recreation of Zal as a coming-of-age story in Y2K to post 9/11 era in New York. But this is the real version. Okay. The Shahnameh Book of Kings is the most famous Persian work of art of all time, the national epic of Iran, penned by Persian poet Ferdowsi circa AD 1000. Its 50,000 couplets chronicle Persia's past from the creation of the world until the 7th century Islamic conquests. Throughout the centuries, what is history and what is myth has been considered almost entirely irrelevant by Iranians, especially my father. One of the Shahnameh's most celebrated stories is the story of Zal. Sam, the great hero of ancient Persia, has a son, Zal, who is born an albino. There are different interpretations of this, but something resembling albinism. The whiteness of the infant's skin horrifies his parents, so they abandon him on the highest point in Iran, Mount Damavand. He is discovered by an enormous bird, the mythical Simurgh, whose wingspan turns the entire sky black when she takes to flight. She becomes his caretaker in the wild. Many years later, a strong, silver-skinned young man is spotted residing in a bird's nest. Sam hears of this, and when he comes to investigate, he realizes the young man is his son. The Simurgh hands Zal over to his home kingdom, but not without a final gift, 3 of her own feathers. She tells Zal she will be back at his side immediately if he only takes one simple action. And this is the quote of the Simurgh. "Burn this if ever you have need of me, and may your heart never forget your nurse, whose heart breaks for love of you." Against all odds, Zal becomes one of the greatest warriors of ancient Persian legend. And so that was, as an outsider and struggling immigrant, that story of the outsider kind of becoming this glorious, symbol of a home country was really inspirational to me. I put mine through some other tests and some other tribulations, but that's that. But thank you so much, and thank you for all your patience. And
We have not a lot of time for Q&A, but what I can say is that, and we have a portable mic, we're about to switch over from this to that. What I can say is that after a few minutes, when we move to the other room for a reception, that will also be a perfect chance for you to interact with the writers and also to pick up a copy, and I'm sure all of them are willing, each of them is willing to inscribe it, right? Yeah, okay. So are we switching over? Testing 1. Ah, good, okay.
Wow.
So
That's
we have
seamless.
time for a few questions. So who's going to be brave and ask the first question? I'm just going to assume Machiar has a question. Do you, in fact? You do. You do.
Well, I think I'm trying to think of a question now, and kind of put on the spot a little bit. But I think in your works, I guess, do you, being Iranian-American writers, I think I myself as an Iranian-American sometimes have felt like people expect me to be an authentic voice of Iranians. Like, what do Iranians think? What do you think? And to be a speaker. Do you feel in your work, what space do you feel that you occupy in your work? Is it in conveying the Iranian, is it an Iranian experience or a uniquely Iranian-American experience that you think you convey?
Great question. Who wants to answer that?
I'll take a stab at it, and maybe both for me personally, and I think in my efforts to anthologize some of this work, I've actually wanted to get past the idea that there is an authentic Iranian voice, or that there is an authentic, universal, cookie cutter version of what it means to be Iranian American. And I think what you heard in both in people's writing and in their biographies, is the idea that nobody has exactly the same experience about when they came or what their class background or what their circumstances. So I think that's actually what's interesting to me, both in terms of reading this material, but also being involved in it, is to the idea that, no, I don't speak for Iran, and I don't necessarily speak for a particular experience of Iranian-Americanness. I think in some ways it's a conversation that is ongoing and still happening, and that's sort of the beauty of being involved with the evolution of a literary voice, is that, you know, there isn't one. And sometimes people hold up one or other of us and say, okay, so you're speaking for that experience. And I think we probably all in some ways shudder at the idea that we can do that.
Somebody else want to take a stab at that?
I agree with what Percy says, and also I think all of us have probably had this experience where we don't feel like we speak for all Iranians by any means, but you know, you'll be like on the ski slopes and the person next to you will say, what do you think about the nuclear program? And you know, it's sort of like, I don't know, and I'm not really thinking about that right now, but I think we get sort of asked these questions. I can't tell you the number of times when I visit book clubs that people ask me about like Rouhani, or you know, and it's terrible, like, because I feel like I'm not an authority on all of that, but I think people see you as such. So I've learned to brush up a little bit on my geopolitical knowledge.
Another question?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by all your stories. But you use this word without borders. I wonder what borders you are trying to get beyond. The Iranian side or the American side or another side. It's intriguing to talk about living without borders, but we all have borders of some kind or another. I wonder if you could reflect on your own personal experiences.
I think I've been very lucky to be an outsider in every culture that I've ever. It was very painful, possibly at times, but I now see that it was a very good thing. I've never fit into whatever, you know, let's say LA Iranian culture, or I don't think I would have fit in. My family members never even fit in so much in Tehran, and in you know, American culture, so many aspects of American culture feel really foreign to me too. I've always been happiest in the fringes and happiest to be a little undefinable. And I have the most freedom there to kind of be myself and all that. So borders for me, if I can, I'm more, I like shadows maybe, without sounding too stealth and mystical in that way. But I think, yeah, I don't know. I think you have to. It's related to the other question, actually, and I think that it is. The pigeonhole can be very toxic, and one has to really fight it, and not be seduced by aspects of the pigeonhole. I was asked for many years to write about, for the New York Times, even I still write for the New York Times, but I have to. I no longer will write a certain type of personal essay. I've made that. Even though I stand behind certain things in my, you know, but what happened on the other end of those things coming out and creating, even contributing to a pigeonhole, for me felt worrying.
Another question? Here's one.
Well, actually, I don't have a question. I have a comment. I wanted to thank you all. I am very grateful. I wish the 12-year-old me that migrated to the United States from Germany would have had access to these stories, because maybe I would have seen myself in this narrative. So I'm grateful to you, because I think we have a new generation of Iranian youth, Middle Eastern youth, that has access to these materials, and they don't feel so marginalized. So I just want to thank you. It's beautiful being here. As an academic, I like this way more than that, but they all speak to each other, though. They speak to each other. Meaning I appreciate this this space more than the academic space, you know. But it's nice. I hope one day to be like FIROOZEH, I can just
Firooze,
jump between all
would
these
you,
various-
since she raised the issue of the academic space versus whatever this is, would you like to comment on that?
Whatever this is. You know, not to be pigeonholed or anything. You know, it's interesting to me because I love to write. Like PAROCHISTA said, I have a diary from when I was 17 years old, and I said in it, I said I will one day write a novel and a history book. I never realized that I would. I'm glad I did. And I will continue to write. It's my salvation. I look at, so for me, when I do my academic work, I'm in the process of writing a second novel and finishing my book now in a decade, even perhaps longer, of U.S.-Iranian relations. I'm on my last chapter, I'm happy to report. Thank you. You know, so as it's just the way I think. I am fascinated by Iran. I'm fascinated by the Middle East. I love the Middle East. I think I don't know how much time you spent in Iran, Anita, but I think among the rest of you, I probably have spent the most time in Iran. And my mom is still there. I mean, she comes and goes, but she spends at least half the year in Iran. So, you know, for me, I don't really, I understand America, but I feel like I'm not completely American. I cannot dissociate myself from my childhood, which is the happiest time of my life, oddly. And so, despite my insomnia as well, I was exactly like that. I still never sleep. But I think the two really are complementary. So I think the academic writing has made me I hope, a more insightful fiction writer, because I can tell stories that if you don't know the history, you're unable to tell. There's one character here in my novel where she was afraid to have kids because she had syphilis. And so that's really all informed by the work I'd done on the history of reproductive health in Iran. So that I imagined this one character having these issues. So I feel like if you like to write, you do it both. You know, you guys do the same thing. You write nonfiction, you write fiction. We just like to write, and we want to tell our experiences about this beautiful country and these beautiful people here, there, despite their craziness. And we all gravitate toward the idiosyncratic, But that's what writers
Maybe
do.
that's the border that needs to be transcended, the supposed border between the academic writing and thinking and the fictive or creative. Maybe that's the border we're talking
I recommend
about.
being in an English department because that's what I do. So, I mean, I straddle those worlds more comfortably, perhaps, because we're all about telling stories. But I also think that one of the artificial boundaries between academic disciplines and fiction writing is that at the core of everything we do as academics is a story. And I think that we sometimes forget that
Yes.
good history or good narratives about science are really about story.
How great it is that the University of Pennsylvania Middle East Center is run by not simply a humanist, but a writer.
Oh, my God.
Right?
I don't know if anyone would agree with
Because
that.
there are all kinds of other disciplines and topics. We have time
Good
for one
Lord,
more
it's a
question
baby.
before a fabulous reception. Okay, then I'm going to ask it since nobody. Okay, several of you embraced the word mainstream in your presentation. Here at the Writers' House, we love to invite avant-gardists and experimentalists, and usually the word mainstream is said and they spit afterwards, But tonight I felt the embrace of a longing for mainstream, and I felt it to be a positive work.
I do
Word.
not.
Okay. I heard it several times, and I wonder if anyone would like to comment on the importance, the positive aspect of writing in the mainstream, feeling like you're part of the mainstream, et cetera.
Can I just say one word and I'll pass? I mean, one sentence really. I mean, I roll my eyes at mainstream, but I think that definition is changing hugely. This past Sunday, I had a Sunday New York Times book review cover for Helen Oyeyemi's Boy Snowbird. Helen Oyeyemi is widely known to be a fairly experimental writer, and she'd been pretty overlooked. This was her fifth novel, and she's now on the Sunday New York Times book cover, and I was also on the Sunday New York Times book cover. I think both of us are seen as somewhat weird writers. So I think, yeah, and then there's nothing more mainstream than the New York Times
There
book
isn't, in
review,
fact,
right?
yes.
So I think, I don't know, is bestseller culture mainstream? I would have to ask for the definition of that, but I do find that word to be very uncomfortable for me personally.
Marjan.
Well, I'm the one who used it. I think for me, you know, when I use that word, I feel like I have to apologize for it, especially at a university. But there is something to be said for accessibility, and there is something to be said for reaching people. So I wouldn't say my novel is necessarily mainstream, but it's more mainstream than a lot of Iranian novels have been. And I'm proud of that. I think it's good for people to read it. And I don't think one is better than the other, but I guess for me, I was that girl growing up who never found the representation of Iranians in the fiction I was reading. So if somebody can get this at Barnes & Noble, some schmo, and read it, that's great. You know what I mean? I want to be a little bit out of the shadows, I guess.
And I want she underestimating
You wanted to be in the
herself.
shadow.
No, I don't. I mean, my book is also, none of us is like crazy avant-garde, but I wanted to say Marjan is a gorgeous writer, and she's underestimating herself a little bit and being a little modest, but she's a beautiful, you know, I've read her work. It's stunning, and it's not, I don't know, that's the problem is what is mainstream? I don't know, in America, is it reality TV culture? Is it, I don't know,
Well,
but I
asked
think
the
we
question
underestimate.
because I felt it to be a word about culture as well
Yeah.
as literary style, right?
But I also think it's the idea of how sometimes ethnic writing gets marginalized and devalued because
that's
it's
the
like
point.
it's speaking through the ethnic voice. And so I think the idea of mainstream is the idea that sometimes we are overlooked or we're overlooked in a kind of dismiss. Oh, that's a nice little ethnic story. And, you know, it's not easy to get published because in some ways this question of marginal versus mainstream has been dominated by a publishing industry that has in some ways held up an idea about Iranians, especially Iranian women. Like, you know, are you telling the veil story? Or are you telling the story of the oppressed woman? And Marjan told us a little narrative last week that I'll ask her to repeat about her struggles in publishing. And I think that's part of the issue, isn't just about being mainstream, but it's also being the idea that like this is a valid American narrative as well, not just a sort of ethnic narrative.
Right. Well, we're going to have to make a transition to a really nice reception and a chance to chat informally with these writers, but this will be our last chance to, as a group together, to put our hands together and thank them for this amazing program. And I said at the beginning that I had been looking forward to this as the director of the Writers' House, and I feel like that's part of that conversation we just had about mainstream. I mean, I think that the Writers' House took a step forward to just welcoming writers, whether it's bordered or bound or ethnic or topical writers. So welcome back to the Kelly Writers' House. Let's thank them one more time for this.